Our text for today is taken from Mark's Gospel, the 4th chapter, beginning in verse 35. The Word of God says, "That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, 'Let us go over to the other side.' Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, don't you care if we drown?' He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, 'Quiet, be still.' Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, 'Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?' They were terrified and asked each other, 'Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him.'" I've read this story many times. Doubtless you have as well. It's a familiar story from the Gospels, one that we may remember from when we were on our mother's knee. But if we pause and linger over the event, we may discover that there are a couple of obvious questions to ask of the participants in that night's drama on the lake. The questions I would like to ask are "how could you" questions. You know, those kinds of questions, we say they're questions, but maybe they aren't really questions. They're more statements of blame disguised as questions. Things like, how could you forget? How could you do that? How could you leave without picking up what I asked you to? We're really blaming, but we're asking. I understand that, but I would still like to ask those kinds of questions to the ones in the boat that night on the lake. The first ones of which I would like to ask the question are the disciples. And since it seems to me as I read the biblical account that Peter is often the one who speaks, I suspect I might fall into dialogue with Peter. So I would say to him, "Peter, I'd like to ask you a question. Here's my question, Peter. How could you? How could you possibly be afraid when Jesus was in the boat?" I wonder how Peter would answer that question. Maybe he would say, "Well, Randy, the truth is, we are the men of the sea. We know how to handle things here on the water, and when things get rough, we know how to take care of it. Jesus, well, he does what he does well. We do what we do well." Maybe that's what Peter would say. Or maybe he would say something more like this. Maybe he would say, "Well, we knew what to do when a storm came onto this lake. We've spent our lives on the lake. And so when the storm blew in, we did what we needed to do. We trimmed the sails. We got it aimed into the wind. We took care of it. We did some bailing over the side, but it just got worse. And I guess we figured, since we're men of the sea, if we couldn't do anything, he couldn't either." Maybe Peter would say that. I suspect, actually, that he might say something like this. That he might say, "We knew exactly what to do when the storm hit, and we did it. But it got worse and worse, to the point where we were so frantically caught up in our efforts to save ourselves with the bailing and the rowing that we just forgot he was there." I suspect Peter would say something like that. But I also suspect Peter wouldn't leave it at that. He was not one to let the other person have the last word. And so I suspect that he might say, "Wait a minute, Randy, I'm not sure I like the tone of your question. How could we forget? Let me ask you a question, Randy. While you're asking me that kind of question, I'll ask you the same. You remember that day you were driving down the freeway next to your house. That day when that couple on a motorcycle had an accident, and you stopped to help, and there was a lot of blood, and you started to touch, but then you stopped, and you looked to make sure there were no cuts on your hands. How could you be afraid, Randy? Doesn't Jesus drive that freeway? Or on your recent flight over here to the UK, when that jet was barreling down the runway just about to take off, and suddenly there was a bang and the whole jet shuddered, and then they shut it down and aborted the takeoff. If I'm not mistaken, you had to swallow your heart just to be able to breathe. What's the matter, Randy? Doesn't Jesus fly Delta? And I think I would say, Peter, that's all right. I'll tell you what. Let's make a deal. You don't ask me any questions. I won't ask you any questions. We'll just admit we've both at times forgotten that Jesus was with us. But let me ask a second question. This one I would like to ask of Jesus. I want to ask it respectfully. He is, after all, our Lord. Now, I have never been in a storm at sea, but I do have some ideas about what I might be doing. If the ship is being buffeted by the waves and is about to go down, I might panic, I might pray and panic, I might bail over the side. More than likely, I'd do something else over the side. There might be a lot of things I might do, but I can guarantee you one thing. There is one thing I absolutely would not do. I would not be sleeping. So Jesus, respectfully, let me ask you, how could you sleep? How could you possibly sleep when the boat is about to go down? I wonder how Jesus would answer that question. Maybe he would say to me, well, Randy, I've always been a deep sleeper. Even when I don't think he would say that. Or maybe he would say to me, Randy, read the story in the gospel. It was a full day packed with people preaching, teaching, healing. By the time we were done and my head hit that pillow, I don't think I would have awakened had the boat gone down. Maybe Jesus would have said that. You know, I noticed something interesting about Jesus in the Gospels. It's interesting how often Jesus followed a certain rabbinic custom. When people would come and would ask him a question, it was not at all uncommon for Jesus to listen to their question, hear them out, then ask them a question, they would answer it, and he would allow that answer to stand. Maybe he would do that here. I come saying to him, Jesus, how could you sleep when the boat was about to go down? He might say to me, Randy, let me ask you something. Do you remember when your family lived in Guadalajara, Mexico? Yes, I remember. Do you remember those long drives you would take from Mexico all the way up to your home in Texas? Oh, I remember those drives very well. What characterized those drives? Well, Jesus, I would say, what characterized them was my father was the kind of driver the which, when he got behind the wheel on a long trip, he wanted to go and go and go until we got there. He didn't want to stop, didn't want to waste time. I can remember us begging to stop, and he'd say, oh, there'll be another place up the way. And so we drove and we drove, which meant that many times we drove all night. Some very dangerous roads through the Mexican Barranca, we called it, through the mountains of Mexico. There were some awful crashes on those roads. And Jesus asks, and what would you do? Well, I was a teenager. I'd sit in the back seat with my sister, and we would play games or talk or fight, as kids will do, until the sun went down. Once it got dark, there really wasn't anything to do. And so we would soon fall asleep and sleep through the night while my father drove for hundreds of miles. We would awaken as the sun peeked over the horizon, many hours and hundreds of miles closer to our destination. Maybe Jesus would say, Randy, even as a teenager, you knew the danger of those highways? Let me ask you a question. How could you sleep when you knew how dangerous it was? And I would say to him, Jesus, that's easy to answer. My father was a good driver. I trusted him. And Jesus might say, yeah, mine too. He's a great captain of ships and of seas and of souls. I would like to end at that point. But I have a suspicion that you might have a how could you question for me. It might sound something like this. Randy, how could you stand there and suggest to us that we can rest in the providence of God? My husband has died. My wife is sick. I haven't heard from my child in a long time. What about that? May I say this to you? I still remember learning it back in seminary. Dr. Abraham Terrian had grown up in Jerusalem as a tour guide, later became a Christian, became a theologian, and taught us. He had rich insights into the world of the day, one of which was this. In the ancient world of which Jesus was a part, the water, often referred to as the deep, was thought to be the abode of chaos, of darkness, of evil. The disciples were a part of their world. They not only knew of such beliefs, they may have believed them as well. And so that night, in the boat, when the storm threatened to grab that little vessel in its grip and plunge it into the dark depths, it was more than just physical danger that they faced. It was the clash of the titans, the war of the ages, the conflict between good and evil, between Christ and Satan. And then suddenly, in the midst of the conflict, Christ, the itinerant rabbi, stands in the ship, stretches forth his arms, and says, "Stop! Be still. This far and no further." And like a mighty giant slowly crumbling to its knees, the storm stops. Jesus will face another storm a few months later. It won't be on a lake. This one will be on Calvary. In this storm, as Jesus hangs suspended between earth and sky, evil will unleash its full fury upon him. This time, the boat goes down. But when it goes down with Jesus in it. And when it goes all the way to the very depths. It hits the deepest, darkest place of that sea. And do you know? When it hits bottom, Jesus pulls the plug. He opens the drain, and that sea begins to drain. It continues to drain today, and will continue until that day when one of those in the boat saw in Revelation and said, "I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and behold, there was no more sea." Drained dry. And we land safely on that distant shore. And so may I answer your question and simply say, how could I preach it? How could I not preach it? May I leave you with these words? Because Jesus trusted, I can too. Because Jesus triumphed, I will